Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we plunge into complex ideas and hopefully surface with some surprising clarity.
That's the goal.
Today, we're tackling some really intricate social questions facing India. And these aren't simple yes or no issues. They live squarely in what we sometimes call the gray region.
Indeed. And it's really in those nuanced spaces, those gray areas, that we can truly begin to understand the fabric of a society, especially one as diverse and, historically rich as India. Avoiding easy answers is absolutely key.
Right. And that's our mission today. We've got two main threads we want to pull on. First, there's the ongoing, very current debate about a caste census in India. You know, what it is, why it's so contentious, what it really means. Then we'll journey into the fascinating and sometimes pretty controversial life of anthropologist Verrier Elwin, and specifically his defining debate with G.S. Ghurye over tribal policy.
A huge debate.
Yeah. So our goal is to try and connect the dots, maybe reveal some unexpected insights. Let's start to untangle this. Okay, so the caste census. At its simplest, it's basically about counting the population size of different caste groups across India. Seems straightforward on the surface, right? Like just data collection.
Well, yes, on the surface. But it's anything but simple. The arguments for doing one are quite compelling, actually.
Okay, like what?
Primarily, it would provide crucial demographic clarity. I mean, imagine truly understanding the social makeup of India, which communities are where in what proportions.
Right.
This kind of granular data is pretty fundamental for, effective governance, for understanding social shifts, and for designing policies that actually work for people. Without it, you're sort of flying blind on some really critical social issues.
Okay, so it's about seeing the landscape clearly to navigate it better. It makes sense from a planning angle.
Precisely. And secondly, it could offer incredible insights into individual caste groups over time. You could track their socio-demographic profiles.
So see how things are changing.
Exactly. Identify smaller communities maybe being absorbed by larger ones, or track conversions to different religions. These are significant social movements that right now remain largely invisible without this kind of precise data.
So not just a snapshot, but like watching the story unfold over time.
Exactly. And third, and this is a really powerful argument, it centers on equitable resource distribution. Think about this. The current OBC Other Backward Classes reservation list, it still largely relies on data from 1931.
1931, wow.
Yeah, almost a century out of date. So a new census could help update this list, maybe remove communities that have progressed significantly and crucially include those who might have fallen into backwardness since then.
Okay.
Proponents like Satish Deshpande argue it could even allow for a quota within a quota.
What does that mean?
It means much more targeted support.
Right.
You could identify and help the most vulnerable groups within those broader OBC categories.
No, it definitely lays out a strong case for doing it. But like you said, it's not simple. There must be strong arguments against it too, right?
Oh, absolutely. This is where the real tension lies. The primary concern, and this was first really articulated by the sociologist G.S. Ghurye, is that a caste census could inadvertently promote caste identities.
How so?
Well, the fear is it could lead to greater social division and conflict. The very act of the state collecting and, validating this data might reinforce caste as a primary identity.
Okay.
And that could undermine the constitutional goal of moving towards a casteless society where loyalty to the nation is supposed to come first.
So the worry is that by trying to count and categorize, the state might actually end up solidifying the very divisions it wants to overcome.
That's a huge worry, yes. Then there's another major issue, the quality of the data itself. How reliable is self-reported caste information, really?
Good point. What could go wrong there?
Well, people might exaggerate their numbers, maybe to gain political influence or power, or conversely, they might underregister out of fear or stigma. Either way, you could end up with bogus or seriously flawed data. There are examples, like in Uttar Pradesh, where some communities, Yadavs, Thakurs, Brahmins, are often thought to inflate their numbers for political leverage.
So if the data isn't accurate, it could actually misguide policy instead of improving it.
Absolutely. And it gets even more complex. Caste is what anthropologists call polysemic.
Polysemic.
Meaning its meaning can change depending on the context. So someone might give an answer based on their immediate situation, or they might confuse their caste, their jati, with their gotra, which is more about lineage or clan.
Or even Varna.
Or Varna, exactly, those broader ancient societal divisions. They're totally different concepts. And that makes accurate enumeration incredibly difficult for the census takers.
And who are these enumerators usually?
Often they're primary school teachers, maybe local health workers like ASHA workers. They might not have the deep sociological understanding needed to navigate these really complex identities accurately.
So it's not just what people say, but how it gets recorded. That adds another layer of potential error.
Indeed. Then there's just the sheer scale and cost.
Yeah.
India has, 1.4 billion people?
Roughly, yeah.
Processing that kind of colossal data set would be unbelievably expensive. It could divert a huge chunk of state GDP and, frankly, demand capacity the government might not even have right now.
Okay, so capacity and costs are major hurdles.
Definitely. And finally, critics like A.M. Shah point out that just having the numbers isn't enough for making good policy on reservations. You also need crucial economic data, things like income, household status, education levels.
Which a simple caste count wouldn't provide.
Exactly. So that numerical data on its own is pretty inadequate for crafting effective social policy.
So we're kind of stuck, aren't we? It sounds like this fundamental paradox for us, the listeners. We want clear data to tackle inequality, but the very act of getting it might deepen the divisions or give us bad data anyway. What really stands out to you about that trade-off?
Well, the core paradox, I think, is that this tool, the census designed for clarity and fairness, might, just by its nature, accidentally strengthen the very lines it aims to understand, or even erase. It really forces us to ask if knowing more always leads to better outcomes, especially with something so deeply embedded in the social structure. It's a tough one.
It really is. Okay, let's shift focus now. From that huge macro view of demographics, let's zoom right in on a really fascinating individual, someone whose personal journey profoundly shaped how India thought about its own tribal communities. Verrier Elwin. His story starts somewhere quite unexpected, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. What's truly remarkable about Elwin is his transformation. He actually started as an Anglican priest, ordained at Oxford, came to India in 1926, part of a Christian mission in Pune.
So his initial goal was conversion.
That was the intent, yes.
Yeah.
But then he was profoundly influenced by Mahatma Gandhi. He even lived in Gandhi's ashram for about 4 years. Gandhi apparently called Elwin his son. Elwin saw these deep parallels between Christianity and Satyagraha. He even called Gandhi the Christ of India at one point, arguing Christians could join the freedom struggle because Jesus' values aligned with Satyagraha.
Okay, so he starts as a missionary, gets deeply influenced by Gandhi. What was the big turning point? What made him leave both those paths behind?
The big shift came in 1932. Elwin moved to Bastar in central India to live among the Gond tribes. And this is where he really broke away. He flat out refused to try and convert them to Christianity.
And that had consequences.
Big ones. The Church of England revoked his license as a priest and preacher because of it. And around the same time, he also grew disenchanted with aspects of Gandhi's philosophy. He found its emphasis on, asceticism, vegetarianism, prohibition, just too restrictive for tribal life.
Why?
Because tribal life often embraced things like liquor, sex, hunting, things that were integral to their culture, not things to be shunned.
That is a profound break, ideologically. From the church, from Gandhism, it sounds like he found something in tribal culture that just fundamentally resonated with him more.
He really did. He decided then to devote his life to studying these tribes. He eventually became an Indian citizen in 1954 and was a key anthropological advisor to the Indian government, especially for NIFA, the Northeast Frontier Agency, which is now Arunachal Pradesh.
Now, there's a controversial aspect to his personal life we should probably touch on. His marriage to Kosi, a Gond girl.
Yes, that's important to mention. He married her when she was very young, maybe 12 or 13. This has led to accusations of, pedophilia.
Right.
Now, from an anthropological standpoint, his defenders argue for cultural relativism. They say marriage at that age was common within that specific cultural context at that time.
But that raises a really difficult question for us today, doesn't it? How do we balance respecting past cultural practices with what we now understand as universal human rights?
Exactly. It's a perfect example of that gray region we were talking about. There's no easy answer there.
No, definitely not. So once Elwin dedicated himself to studying and working with tribal communities, what was his main policy idea? He became known for this isolationist policy.
Yes, that was his core idea, especially early on. He laid it out in his 1943 monograph, The Aboriginals. It was this, quite radical concept of protecting tribal communities through a form of isolation.
Why did he think that was necessary?
Because he had observed several really destructive factors at play. First, colonial policies were just disastrous for them. They restricted traditional forest rights, imposed taxes that forced non-money economies into cash.
Creating debt.
Exactly. Vicious cycles of debt and dependency. Compelling settled agriculture when they might have been semi-nomadic. It was fundamentally disruptive.
So outside systems were like an invasive species, disrupting their whole way of life.
That's a good way to put it. Second, he saw ruthless exploitation by outsiders, moneylenders, merchants, even some officials. They introduced alcohol, leading to addiction, land loss, bonded labor.
Awful.
Yeah. Third, he saw missionaries, both Hindu and Christian, actively attacking tribal cultural identity. Their traditions, rituals, practices, often, under the banner of improving or civilizing them.
Undermining their core beliefs.
Right. And finally, the introduction of modern tech and values often destroyed traditional skills and their means of subsistence. This led to what Elwin called a loss of nerve, a deep degradation of their basic identity, their lifeline.
So he saw these external forces not as progress, but as leading to cultural destruction and economic ruin.
That was his firm belief. He felt tribal people were, in his words, special people who needed to be kept separate from the rest of Indian society. Why? To conserve and preserve their ethnic identity, tribal structure, and way of life.
Because contact was an unequal contest.
Precisely. He believed contact exposed them to unlimited exploitation. So practically, he advocated for creating autonomous areas governed by traditional customs with minimal government interference and requiring special permission for outsiders to even enter.
And we still see traces of that today.
Absolutely. Concepts like scheduled areas and the interline permit system in some parts of India definitely echo Elwin's early ideas.
But that raises a really big question, doesn't it? Can complete isolation truly protect a culture in the long run? Or does it risk just leaving them behind, cut off from opportunities? What strikes you most about the long-term trade-offs there?
Well, the insight, I think, is that profound tension between protection and, let's call it, progress or engagement. Elwin saw the immediate, devastating threat of exploitation, so isolation seemed like a logical defense. But it really begs the question, how long can any society stay truly isolated in our interconnected world without facing totally new challenges, or maybe missing out on chances for development on their own terms? It just highlights how incredibly complex it is to respect cultural integrity while also enabling growth and adaptation.
It's really fascinating, though, how Elwin's ideas didn't just stay as strict isolation. He became this pivotal advisor later on, especially in India's northeast. And people often say Arunachal Pradesh, unlike some other states there, had relatively minimal militancy after independence. And that's often credited to Elwin's more nuanced approach later. How did his thinking evolve?
Right. His later work, especially as an advisor, was arguably quite revolutionary for its time. And I think many of these ideas still hold a lot of relevance today. In his monograph, A Philosophy for NAIFA, he laid out 5 key principles for tribal development. And Jawaharlal Nehru, India's first prime minister, famously adopted these as the tribal panchayil, the 5 principles for tribes.
Okay, 5 principles. What was the first one?
The first was that tribes should develop along their own genius.
Their own genius,
meaning you enhance their traditional skills, things like weaving, herding, and you connect those skills to markets. You don't just impose external subjects like, say, algebra or computer science if they're not immediately relevant to their way of life. It was about building on their unique cultural strengths, not forcing them into some external mold.
Okay, so respect and promote their inherent skills and knowledge. Don't just try to make them conform. What's number 2?
Second, their traditional rights over land and forests must be protected and respected. Given the history of exploitation he had seen, this was absolutely critical for him.
Makes sense. And the third?
Third, he strongly argued against over-administration and having too many different complex schemes. He felt overwhelming tribal communities with lots of officers, or siloed programs for education, health, agriculture. It would just be counterproductive.
So simplify things.
Exactly. He pushed for a single window approach for delivering benefits and services.
How do you think that would make things easier for the communities themselves?
Oh, massively. It cuts through bureaucracy, confusion, makes services way more accessible, surely.
That was the idea. The 4th principle was crucial. Train natives.
Meaning people from the tribes themselves.
Yes. Instead of sending outsiders who, let's be honest, often saw tribal postings as a kind of punishment and were frequently absent, Elwin argued for training tribal individuals from within their own communities to manage their own affairs. Teachers, healthcare experts, administrators.
What's the benefit of that? It seems obvious, but spell it out.
Well, it fosters trust, doesn't it? It ensures cultural understanding, continuity. It's fundamentally about empowering them to be self-sufficient in the long run. Right, empowering them. Okay. And the 5th principle.
Finally, and this one is quite profound, I think, Elwin stressed that development shouldn't just be measured by statistics or how much money was spent. It should be judged by the quality of character evolved.
Quality of character, what does he mean by that?
He meant looking at qualitative factors. How empowered do tribal people actually feel? Are their living standards genuinely improving? Are their rights and dignity truly being respected? It was a deeply empathetic, human-centric way to look at development.
That's very different from just looking at GDP figures or literacy rates.
Very different. And he was so committed to this, he even helped create a unique administrative service, the Indian Frontier Administrative Services, or IFS. These were officers specifically chosen for being capable, committed, culturally sensitive. They lived simply, built strong rapport. He was apparently still interviewing candidates for IFS on his deathbed in 1964.
Wow. That's incredible dedication. It really shows how deeply he believed in this philosophy, doesn't it? Okay, so we've explored Elwin's ideas, his evolution. But now we have to get into that great debate. Elwin versus Ghurye. This was a really fundamental clash about how India should approach its tribal populations. What was G.S. Ghurye arguing?
Right. G.S. Ghurye, who was a very prominent, very influential sociologist, took a completely different stance. He essentially viewed tribes as backward Hindus.
Backward Hindus.
Yes. He believed they should be assimilated into the mainstream Hindu fold. He argued that Elwin's isolationist policy was actually keeping them underdeveloped, separate from the flow of Indian nationalism in society. For Ghurye, keeping them distinct was hindering their integration.
And Elwin's counter. He obviously believed in protecting that unique identity.
Absolutely. Elwin argued forcefully that tribes had a unique collective community spirit, very distinct from mainstream Hindu religion. He pointed to things like the general absence of caste within tribal societies, their close spiritual ties to nature, relatively more egalitarian gender relations.
So fundamental differences.
Yes. And he firmly believed that assimilation wouldn't just change them, it would destroy their unique culture, and crucially, expose them to the very exploitation he had spent years observing and documenting.
It really sounds like a clash of fundamental beliefs about what progress even means and what nation building should look like for these specific communities. Now, Ghurye's views faced a lot of criticism, didn't they?
They did. Significant criticism. Critics argued that Ghurye's views were maybe too heavily influenced by his own nationalist leanings. This, they felt, led him to sort of overglorify the caste system, presenting it as more harmonious and non-exploitative than it often was in reality.
Ignoring the downsides.
Ignoring or downplaying the harsh realities like untouchability, pervasive exploitation, violence. Critics said he presented a very static, pan-Indian, rigid view of caste, based mainly on ancient religious texts, what anthropologists call a book view.
As opposed to
the field view, which you actually observe on the ground. And the field view shows that caste dynamics are incredibly complex, varied, fluid. They change from region to region.
Can you give an example of that difference?
Sure. Take the Mahapatra Brahmins of Benares. Now, textually, they're Brahmins, right at the top. But in lived reality, because they perform funeral rites, they're often considered untouchable. People avoid their shadow because it's seen as polluting. That vividly shows how complex and, counterintuitive caste realities can be, defying a simple textual definition.
So Ghurye's understanding was maybe too theoretical, not grounded enough in lived experience.
That was the criticism, yes, that it could lead to a flawed picture. Also, some of his foundational ideas were linked to the Aryan invasion theory, which, most modern scholarship has largely rejected. So if the foundation is shaky,
the whole structure built on it is questionable.
Exactly. Critics also talk about a potential Hinduization of anthropology in his work. By sometimes seeming to equate Indian culture primarily with Vedic or Hindu culture, he perhaps overlooked the huge contributions and changes brought by centuries of Islamic rule, British influence, and of course, indigenous traditions themselves.
Okay, and his specific idea of tribes as backward Hindus.
That faced criticism too. For one, there wasn't strong, broad historical evidence that all tribes were simply absorbed into Hinduism. Many tribal religious practices clearly predate Hinduism. It also massively oversimplified the incredible diversity of India's tribal culture, sort of lumping them all together. And ultimately, it was seen by some as ethnocentric, viewing Hindu culture as the sort of normative standard against which others were judged and found, backward or less developed.
So imposing one dominant cultural lens, but let's be fair, Elwin's isolation policy, even if well-intentioned, wasn't perfect either, right? It faced its own criticisms. How did that idea of isolation come back to bite us, as some put it?
Yes, that's crucial. Even well-meaning policies can have unintended negative consequences. One major criticism of Elwin's isolationism is that by limiting the presence and influence of the mainstream Indian state and society, it inadvertently created a space.
A vacuum?
Kind of. A space that allowed Christian missionaries, for instance, to really strengthen their foothold in many tribal areas. This led to quite widespread conversions in some regions, as they were often the primary providers of education and healthcare where the state wasn't present.
So isolation created an opening for other external influences. Were there other significant consequences, perhaps more destabilizing ones?
Well, some argue that in certain cases, this isolation also contributed, perhaps indirectly, to the rise of secessionist movements, particularly in parts of the Northeast. The argument is that the lack of strong integration with the rest of India, combined with a strong separate identity sometimes fostered by external groups like certain missionary organizations, could create fertile ground for movements seeking independence. For instance, you see groups like the American Baptist Church historically playing roles as mediators between Naga groups and the Indian government. Or more recently, during the Kuki-Meitei conflict in Manipur, you had Baptist churches, even from the U.S., among the first proposing peace interventions.
So the vacuum left by isolation wasn't empty. It was sometimes filled by other powerful entities.
That's the argument.
Yeah.
And these entities sometimes had agendas that complicated the integration of these communities into the broader national fabric, occasionally even fueling separatist sentiments.
That's truly fascinating. How a policy designed purely for protection could unintentionally pave the way for different kinds of external influence, and maybe even contribute to conflict down the line.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground. the complexities of the caste census, Elwin's incredible journey, the big debate over tribal policy. As we wrap up this deep dive, what's one crucial takeaway for you about navigating these kinds of gray regions, something you hope listeners will really mull over?
For me, I think it constantly comes back to that tension between universal principles like equality or human rights and the very specific, complex realities of diverse cultures and histories. We saw it with the caste census, right, where the drive for data clarity might actually deepen divisions. And we saw it with Verrier Elwin's journey, how deep personal observation completely shifted his view of what progress or protection should even mean for a community. Both these stories, I think, highlight that there really are no easy black and white answers.
No simple solutions. None. There's only, perhaps, a commitment to trying to achieve a nuanced understanding and being willing to continuously reevaluate our approaches. It's about accepting that some of the most important questions in society just won't have simple fixes, and tackling them requires empathy, critical thinking, and just a deep appreciation for the human experience in all its messy, complicated forms.
That's a really powerful thought to leave us with. It really underscores that being truly informed isn't just about knowing the facts, is it? It's about understanding all those intricate layers beneath them. I definitely encourage you, our listeners, to explore further. Maybe look into contemporary tribal rights movements in India, or delve deeper into the ongoing debates around identity politics and data collection in diverse democracies worldwide. There's always more to learn in these fascinating gray regions.